The eviction notice was taped to Sarah Chen's apartment door when she returned from her third rejected job interview that week, the bright orange paper announcing she had 14 days to vacate premises or face forcible removal. Her 7-year-old daughter Lily stood beside her reading the words she shouldn't have been able to understand yet, her small hand tightening around Sarah's as reality settled over both of them like cold water. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been surviving on unemployment benefits since the factory where she'd worked for 6 years closed without warning, had been stretching food stamps and scraping together rent payments that were always late but until now had been accepted. Her ex-husband sent child support when he remembered, which was rarely, and her family back in California had made it clear they considered her Oregon move a mistake they wouldn't subsidize. She was 32 years old with a business degree she'd never finished and work history in manufacturing jobs that were disappearing faster than she could find replacements. The math was simple and brutal. 14 days to find first month's rent, last month's rent, and security deposit on a new apartment when she had negative $73 in her checking account and credit cards that had been maxed out months ago. Or find somewhere else to go with a 7-year-old daughter who'd already changed schools twice in 3 years, who deserved stability Sarah couldn't provide. That evening, Lily asked the question Sarah had been dreading. Are we going to be homeless? They were eating dinner at the small table in their studio apartment, mac and cheese from a box stretched with frozen vegetables. Sarah could lie, could offer reassurances she didn't believe, or she could treat her daughter with the honesty Lily had earned through 2 years of watching their circumstances deteriorate. I don't know yet, sweetheart. But I'm going to figure something out. I always do. Mom, you say that every time things get bad. But they keep getting worse anyway. Lily's voice carried the exhausted wisdom of children who'd learned too young that adults couldn't always protect them from reality. The words hit harder than anger would have, cut deeper because they were true. Sarah had been saying everything would be okay for 2 years while proof accumulated that okay was a promise she couldn't keep through determination alone. She spent that night searching rental listings she couldn't afford and job postings that required experience or certifications she didn't have, desperation making her consider options she'd previously dismissed as too risky or degrading. Around midnight, scrolling through classified ads, she found something that stopped her, a county foreclosure auction scheduled for the next morning, properties being sold to recover unpaid taxes and liens. Most listings were residential foreclosures Sarah couldn't afford even at auction prices, but one caught her attention. Industrial property, former cannery operation, Riverside location, starting bid $300. The description was minimal, 5.2 acres, multiple buildings, closed 1982, severe structural deterioration, sold as is with no warranties or inspections. Sarah knew nothing about canneries or industrial properties or what you did with 5 acres of deteriorating buildings. But $300 was potentially achievable if she scraped together everything she had, if she sold the few things of value she still owned, if she took the kind of desperate gamble that people made when all reasonable options had been exhausted. The auction started at 10 the next morning at the county courthouse. Sarah brought Lily because she had no childcare and because some part of her wanted her daughter to see that trying mattered even when success wasn't guaranteed. They sat in the back of the room while properties were auctioned, watching people bid on houses and land and commercial buildings with the casual confidence of those who had money to spend on investment opportunities. The cannery came up 40 minutes in, the auctioneer's description making it sound worse than the listing had suggested. Riverside Cannery, 5.2 acres, multiple structures, closed 42 years ago, extensive rust and water damage, environmental assessment required, buyer responsible for all cleanup and remediation costs. Opening bid $300. Silence stretched across the room, nobody willing to bid on property that came with unknown liabilities and certain expenses. Sarah raised her hand, her voice barely audible. 300. The auctioneer looked surprised that anyone had bid. I have 300, do I hear 350? More silence. Sarah held her breath, counting the $378 in her purse that represented everything she could scrape together by selling her laptop and her wedding ring and asking her neighbor for a short-term loan she had no idea how to repay. Going once at $300. Going twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down. Sold for $300 to bidder 17. Sarah sat frozen, unable to process that she'd just purchased 5 acres of industrial property she'd never seen for money she didn't have, that her desperate gamble had somehow worked even though she had no plan for what came next. Lily squeezed her hand, her expression showing she understood they'd crossed some threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. "What are we going to do with the cannery?" Lily whispered. "I have absolutely no idea." The paperwork took 3 hours, fees and taxes bringing the total to $395 that emptied Sarah's purse and left her with negative $17 once the neighbor loan was repaid. The clerk handed her a deed and a key and directions to a property she now legally owned but couldn't afford to visit because her car's gas tank was nearly empty. They drove to the cannery the next morning, Sarah using the last of her gas to reach an address that led them down a gravel road through scrub forest to a clearing that held exactly what the auction description had promised: deterioration and rust and the accumulated weight of 40 years of abandonment. The main cannery building was massive, easily 200 feet long and 60 feet wide, its corrugated metal siding oxidized to brown-orange decay. Windows were broken or missing entirely, their frames hanging like empty eye sockets. The roof sagged in places, showed holes in others, spoke of structural damage that would cost more to fix than Sarah could imagine having. 2 smaller outbuildings stood nearby in similar states of collapse, and what had probably been an office building was now a gutted shell with a tree growing through its floor. The property sat beside a river that had given the cannery its name, water flowing past with the patient persistence that had been here before the buildings and would remain after they collapsed completely. The land itself was beautiful in the way abandoned industrial sites sometimes were, nature reclaiming what humans had given up, rust and decay creating their own aesthetic of failure and persistence. Sarah stood looking at the property she'd bought out of desperation, trying to see value in buildings that were probably worth less than the cost of demolishing them. Lily explored the perimeter carefully, her 7-year-old curiosity tempered by caution their circumstances had taught. "Can we go inside?" Lily called from the cannery's main entrance, a sliding door hanging half open on rusted tracks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's first instinct was to say no, to keep them away from structures that looked ready to collapse. But they owned this property now, and understanding what they'd bought required seeing inside even if what they found was just confirmation of a mistake that couldn't be undone. The interior was exactly what she'd expected, industrial space gutted by time and weather, empty except for rusted equipment that had been deemed worthless when the cannery closed. The concrete floor was cracked and stained, showing where machinery had once stood, where production lines had processed food Sarah could only guess at. The ceiling was 40 feet overhead, its metal trusses corroded, birds nesting in the rafters. But it was the smell that struck Sarah most forcefully, not decay or mold like she'd expected, but something almost sweet, like fruit that had rotted decades ago still leaving traces in the air. The cannery had processed something, had been alive with workers and production and purpose before economics or circumstances had closed it, had left this shell as monument to industries that served communities before moving on. They walked through the space carefully, Sarah's mind racing through impossible calculations about renovation costs and potential uses, about whether 5 acres of deteriorating buildings represented opportunity or just a different kind of desperation than the eviction notice they were trying to escape. Lily found it first, her sharp eyes noticing what Sarah had missed. A section of floor near the back wall where the concrete looked different, smoother, newer, sealed with material that didn't match the rest of the industrial surface. The area was maybe 15 feet square, marked by subtle changes in color and texture that suggested it had been poured separately from the main floor. "Mom, why is this part different?" Sarah knelt beside the sealed section, running her hand over concrete that felt wrong somehow, that seemed to cover something rather than just provide foundation. She found an edge where the newer concrete met the original floor, noticed that the seal wasn't perfect, that there was a gap maybe half an inch wide that suggested the sealed section was a cap over something beneath rather than integral floor. Her phone had no service this far from town, but it still had a flashlight function. Sarah shined it into the gap, seeing darkness that extended down further than the concrete's thickness should allow, seeing what looked like metal beneath the seal. "There's something under here," she said, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and caution. "Like a chamber or vault that someone sealed over with concrete. Can we open it?" Sarah thought about this, about property ownership and legal rights and the fact that whatever lay beneath this concrete was technically hers now, discovered on land she'd legally purchased. But she also thought about common sense and safety and the reality that breaking into sealed underground chambers without knowing what they contained was the kind of choice that led to disasters. Not without understanding what we're dealing with first. And not without tools we don't have. But the discovery had shifted something in Sarah's thinking about the property. The cannery might be worthless as building, but whatever was sealed beneath its floor represented unknown possibility, suggested that someone had valued something enough to hide it and seal it and abandon the entire property rather than reveal what lay protected. They were loading back into the car when a black SUV pulled up the gravel road, expensive and out of place against the property's decay. A man in his 50s stepped out, dressed in business casual that looked wrong for rural Oregon, carrying himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what they wanted. "You must be the new owner," he said, approaching with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Robert Morrison, Morrison Development Group. We've been tracking this property for years, waiting for it to come up for foreclosure. I'd like to make you an offer." Sarah felt warning bells she'd learned to trust through years of navigating difficult situations. "I just bought it yesterday. I haven't even decided what I'm doing with it." "Which is exactly why my offer makes sense." "You paid what, $300 or $400 at auction? I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 right now, today, for immediate transfer of the deed. That's a significant profit for 24 hours of ownership. Why would you pay $5,000 for property that sold for $300? Morrison's smile tightened slightly. "The Morrison family has history with this property. My grandfather worked at the cannery in the 50s, my father tried to purchase it when it closed in '82. We have sentimental attachment and development plans that make the asking price reasonable." It was the kind of explanation that sounded plausible but felt wrong, that answered the question without actually explaining anything. Sarah had worked enough sales jobs to recognize when someone was offering too much money too quickly, when desperation was being disguised as generosity. "I'm not interested in selling yet. I need time to evaluate what I've got here." "Mrs. Chen, it is Mrs. Chen, right? I know your circumstances. I know you're facing eviction, that you have a daughter to provide for, that $5,000 could solve immediate problems." Morrison's tone shifted from friendly to pointed. "This property requires significant investment just to make it safe, let alone useful. You're looking at tens of thousands in demolition or renovation costs, environmental cleanup that could cost even more. Taking my offer makes sense for someone in your situation." The fact that he knew her name and circumstances when she'd never met him confirmed Sarah's suspicions that this wasn't coincidental interest. Morrison had been watching the property, had known it was going to auction, had expected to acquire it himself and was now scrambling to buy it from whoever had outbid him. The answer is no. If the property is so worthless, you wouldn't be offering $5,000 for it. Which means there's something here you know about that I don't, and I'm going to find out what that is before I make any decisions about selling. Morrison's friendly demeanor dropped completely. "You're making a mistake. The cannery has complications you don't understand, history that goes beyond simple property ownership. My family has been patient for 40 years, but our patience has limits." "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice from someone who knows this property better than you do." Morrison handed her a business card. "When you discover how expensive owning this place actually is, call me. The offer will still be available, though the price might be lower depending on how long you wait." After he drove away, Lily looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed fear and curiosity. "What do you think is under the floor?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever it is, the Morrison family wants it badly enough to offer money they wouldn't spend if this was just about sentimental attachment to a property their grandfather worked at 40 years ago. That evening, Sarah used the library's internet to research the Riverside Cannery and the Morrison family. What she found deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The cannery had operated from 1928 to 1982, processing fruit from local orchards, employing up to 300 people at its peak. It had been owned by the Henderson family for 3 generations before closing during the economic recession that killed many rural food processing operations. But the closure had been unusual. Most canneries that failed in the 80s sold their equipment, auctioned their assets, went through normal bankruptcy proceedings. Riverside Cannery had simply locked its doors one day in 1982 and never reopened, its machinery left in place, its final owner, James Henderson, dying 6 months later at age 78 without heirs or explanation for why he'd abandoned a facility that had been profitable as recently as 1980. The Morrison family appeared in multiple news articles from the 80s, Robert's father Thomas Morrison having fought a legal battle to acquire the cannery property after Henderson's death. He'd claimed the family had been promised right of first refusal, that they'd invested in plans to purchase and redevelop the site. But Henderson's will had left the property in a trust that prevented sale for 40 years, effectively freezing it until the foreclosure auction Sarah had just won. Whatever lay beneath that sealed floor, it had been important enough that James Henderson had died protecting it, had structured his estate to prevent the Morrisons from accessing the property for 4 decades, had sacrificed his family's only significant asset to ensure that whatever he'd hidden stayed hidden until someone else discovered it. Sarah stood in the library holding printouts of articles and property records and legal battles that suggested she'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a desperate real estate gamble. She owned a cannery that was worthless as building but that concealed something valuable enough to trigger 40 years of Morrison family obsession. And she had maybe 2 weeks before eviction and no resources to investigate what she'd found or defend what she legally owned. The sealed floor waited in darkness, holding secrets that had rested since 1982, that represented either salvation or another kind of trap for a single mother who'd bought abandoned property because she'd run out of reasonable options. Whatever lay beneath that concrete, treasure or liability, wealth or complication, would determine whether Sarah's desperate gamble had been the worst mistake of her life or the kind of impossible luck that changed everything when you needed changing most. Sarah spent the next 3 days researching everything she could find about James Henderson and the cannery's final years. The library became her office, Lily doing homework at adjacent tables while Sarah pieced together a history that revealed itself in fragments, newspaper articles, county records, obituaries that mentioned the cannery in passing. She found a name that appeared repeatedly in articles about Henderson, Margaret Torres, his bookkeeper for 30 years, who'd been quoted in a 1982 article about the cannery's sudden closure. Margaret was listed as still living in town, her address in the phone directory that the library maintained for people who still used such things. The visit happened on a Thursday afternoon, Sarah bringing Lily because she had nowhere else to leave her, both of them standing on the porch of a small house that showed the careful maintenance of someone who'd lived there for decades. Margaret answered the door looking every bit of her 86 years, her eyes sharp despite her age, her expression suggesting she'd been expecting this visit eventually. "You bought the cannery," Margaret said before Sarah could introduce herself. "I saw the auction notice, wondered who'd be desperate or curious enough to bid on a property everyone's been afraid to touch for 40 years. Desperate covers it," Sarah admitted. "Can we talk about James Henderson and what he left there?" Margaret invited them in, made tea with the deliberate movements of someone for whom ritual mattered, waited until they were settled before speaking. "James knew he was dying. Heart disease, the doctors said maybe 6 months. He spent his final weeks doing something at the cannery, working alone at night when nobody else was there. When he died, the Morrison family showed up within days claiming they'd been promised the property, demanding access. But Henderson's will prevented that. His will put the cannery in a 40-year trust, specified it couldn't be sold or accessed except for basic maintenance. The Morrisons fought it in court for years, claimed James had been mentally incompetent, that the trust was invalid. But the will was solid, and James had documented his reasoning. He wanted 40 years to pass before anyone could claim what he'd hidden there. Do you know what he hid? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, measuring Sarah with eyes that had seen enough to judge character. James never told me directly, but I kept his books for 30 years, knew the cannery's finances better than anyone. In 1933, during the worst of the Depression, the cannery had its most profitable year ever. Fruit prices collapsed, farmers were desperate to sell anything for any price, and James bought everything they brought. He processed it, sold it at minimal markup, kept people employed when every other business was failing. She pulled out a folder she'd clearly prepared years ago, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The cannery did $2 million in business that year. But James only reported $300,000 in profit to the IRS. The other $1.7 million just disappeared from the books, no explanation, no accounting for where it went. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. He hid it. I think so, yes. And not just that year, I found similar discrepancies through the late 30s, smaller amounts but consistent. James was converting profit to cash and hiding it somewhere, and I think he spent his final weeks moving it all to one location, sealing it where the Morrisons couldn't find it even if they got access to the property. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because James was a good man who paid fair wages during the Depression and kept this town employed when everyone else was laying people off. If he wanted to hide money from the government or from grasping relatives, that was his business. Margaret's expression hardened. The Morrisons aren't good people, Sarah. Thomas Morrison's father worked at the cannery in the 30s, got himself fired for stealing. The family's been bitter ever since, convinced they're owed something. When James died, they came after the property like vultures. After leaving Margaret's house, Sarah understood what she was dealing with, potentially millions of dollars in Depression-era currency and assets hidden beneath the cannery floor, protected by a man who'd died ensuring the Morrisons couldn't claim it. The question was how to access it without tools or expertise, and what happened when she actually found what Margaret believed was there. She borrowed bolt cutters and a sledgehammer from the hardware store owner who took pity on her situation, drove back to the cannery with Lily and a sense that whatever happened next would be irreversible. The sealed concrete section waited in the cannery's dim interior, holding 40 years of secrets that would transform their circumstances or reveal that her desperate hopes were just another kind of poverty. Stay back while I work on this, Sarah told Lily, positioning her near the entrance where falling concrete wouldn't reach. The sledgehammer felt heavy in hands more accustomed to factory assembly work than demolition. Sarah swung at the concrete's edge where it met the original floor, the impact reverberating through her arms, chips flying but the seal holding. She swung again, then again, finding rhythm in the physical work, feeling concrete crack and shift under repeated impacts. After 20 minutes, she'd created a gap wide enough to see what lay beneath. Not floor or foundation, but a metal door set horizontally in the ground, its surface showing rust but its structure still solid. The door had a combination lock mechanism, old-fashioned but functional, requiring a code Sarah didn't have. She was considering her options when she heard vehicles approaching, multiple engines suggesting more than casual visitors. Sarah pulled Lily close, both of them moving toward the entrance as 3 trucks pulled up, Robert Morrison's SUV and 2 pickups carrying men who looked like they'd been hired for intimidation rather than conversation. Morrison stepped out carrying documents and an expression that suggested friendly offers were over. Mrs. Chen, I'm here to inform you that we've filed a legal challenge to your ownership of this property. We have documentation showing the foreclosure auction was improperly conducted, that the Morrison family had standing claims that should have been honored before public sale. That's not true. The auction was legal. Truth is what courts decide, and courts favor parties with resources to pursue lengthy litigation. Morrison gestured to his companions. We're also here to conduct a preliminary inspection of the property under our rights as interested parties in the legal dispute. You'll need to provide access to all structures. Sarah recognized the tactic, create legal complications that required expensive defense, conduct inspections that were really searches for whatever they believed was here, make ownership so complicated and costly that settling for a fraction of value looked reasonable. You're not conducting anything without a court order. This is my property, And you're trespassing. Leave now or I'm calling the sheriff." Morrison's pleasant demeanor evaporated. "You have no idea what you're protecting or who you're fighting. My family has waited 40 years for access to this property. James Henderson stole what rightfully belonged to my grandfather, sealed it away out of spite, and died before he could be held accountable. That sealed vault is the Morrison family's legacy, not yours. Then your grandfather should have been honest instead of getting fired for theft. Margaret Torres told me everything, how your family has been trying to claim something that was never yours, how you've harassed every owner and fought every legal battle because you believe you're entitled to wealth someone else earned." The revelation that Sarah had spoken to Margaret clearly rattled Morrison. His men shifted uncomfortably, looking less certain about whatever they'd been told to expect. "Margaret Torres is 90 years old and remembers history the way she wants to remember it," Morrison said tightly. "The reality is that my grandfather was a partner in the Cannery's Depression-era operations, that James Henderson cheated him out of his share, that the wealth hidden on this property belongs to both families, not just the Hendersons. If that's true, prove it in court. Until then, get off my property." Morrison took a step closer, his voice dropping to a tone that carried clear threat. "You're a single mother facing eviction with a child to support. Fighting us will cost tens of thousands in legal fees you don't have. We'll tie this property up for years, make it impossible for you to sell or develop, ensure that owning it becomes the most expensive mistake you've ever made. Or you can take our revised offer, $10,000, paid today, and you walk away with money to solve your immediate problems." Sarah felt Lily's hand tighten in hers, felt the weight of decisions that would teach her daughter lessons about courage or pragmatism, about standing for principles or accepting reality. $10,000 would solve their immediate crisis, would give them breathing room to find stability. But it would also mean surrendering to pressure from people who'd spent 40 years trying to claim something that wasn't theirs, who'd harassed James Henderson and now were doing the same to her. The answer is no. And if you're not gone in 60 seconds, I'm calling law enforcement and documenting harassment. Morrison's expression showed he hadn't expected resistance, that he'd assumed desperation would overcome stubbornness. "You'll regret this. We have lawyers who specialize in breaking people who don't know when to accept reasonable offers. By the time we're done, you'll have nothing, no property, no settlement, nothing but legal debt and the knowledge that you could have had $10,000. After they left, Sarah stood shaking with adrenaline and fear, understanding she'd just committed to a fight she couldn't afford against people who'd been preparing for this battle for 40 years. Lily was crying quietly, scared by confrontation that had felt close to violence, by men whose size and anger had made the Cannery feel dangerous. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Sarah said, pulling her daughter close. "I know that was scary. Why didn't you take their money? $10,000 would help us. Because teaching you that powerful people can take what they want if they pressure hard enough would cost more than any amount of money could be worth." Sarah wiped Lily's tears. "Your great-grandmother came to America with nothing, built a life through refusing to accept that being poor meant being powerless. I'm not going to dishonor that by surrendering to people like Morrison just because fighting is hard. But saying it was easier than believing it." That evening, Sarah met with a lawyer whose name Margaret had provided, Patricia Walsh, who'd practiced in the county for 40 years and knew the Morrison family's reputation. Patricia's office was above a diner, shabby but functional, decorated with photos of cases won and families helped. "The Morrisons' legal challenge is nonsense," Patricia said after reviewing the auction documents. "The foreclosure was properly conducted, you're the legitimate owner, and their claim about prior rights is fabricated. But defending against nonsense still costs money, still requires filing responses and attending hearings and treating frivolous claims seriously because courts don't dismiss cases without due process. How much are we talking? 5 to 10,000 in legal fees if they pursue this aggressively. More if they file appeals or additional challenges." Patricia's expression showed she'd had this conversation before. "I can work on partial contingency, reduced hourly rate now, percentage of value if we discover something worth claiming. But Sarah, you need to understand what you're really dealing with here." She pulled out files documenting the Morrison family's history, legal battles over properties across the county, pressure tactics that walked the line between legal and harassment, a pattern of acquiring assets through making ownership too expensive to defend. Thomas Morrison built his wealth through exactly this strategy. Find properties with unclear titles or disputed claims, file legal challenges that cost more to fight than settle, wait out owners who can't afford extended litigation. He's done it successfully 20 times over 40 years. Robert learned from his father and is even more aggressive about it. What are my chances of actually winning? In court? Excellent. Your ownership is clear, the auction was legitimate. But winning takes time and money, and the Morrisons know how to make the process expensive enough that victory feels like losing. Patricia paused. Unless there's something in that sealed vault valuable enough to justify the fight. Margaret believes James Henderson hid Depression-era assets. If that's true, if there's actually significant wealth there, then defending your claim makes sense. But if the vault is empty or contains less than the cost of litigation, you'd be better off settling. Sarah thought about the metal door beneath the cannery floor, about the combination lock she couldn't open, about Margaret's certainty that James Henderson had hidden millions. How do I find out what's actually there? Carefully and legally. Any assets you discover belong to the property owner, but only if they're accessed properly. Breaking into sealed vaults without documentation can create complications about chain of custody and legitimate discovery. Patricia made notes on her legal pad. I'll file responses to the Morrisons' challenge, establish your ownership clearly. While that's happening, you need to document everything about that sealed floor, when you discovered it, what it looks like, your good faith belief about what it might contain. Then we'll petition the court for permission to access it under proper supervision. That could take months. It could. Or the Morrisons might escalate their pressure, might do something stupid that gives us leverage. Morrison families have been patient for 40 years, but they're not known for good judgment when they feel close to getting what they want. The escalation came 2 nights later. Sarah was sleeping in her car at the Cannery, couldn't afford the motel, and the apartment's eviction deadline had passed, when headlights woke her around 2 a.m. The same trucks from Morrison's visit, men emerging with equipment that looked more like a breaking and entering operation than legal property inspection. Sarah had hidden Lily at a friend's house for exactly this scenario, had prepared for the possibility that Morrison wouldn't wait for courts to resolve what he believed he could take directly. She called 911 from inside the car, describing what she was seeing, waiting for law enforcement while Morrison's men worked on the Cannery's entrance. The sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later, his appearance causing Morrison's men to scatter back to their trucks. Morrison himself stayed, his expression showing this had been calculated risk rather than impulsive mistake. We have documentation of our claim to this property, Morrison told the deputy, holding papers that looked official from a distance. We're conducting authorized inspection of assets we have legal standing to access. At 2 a.m? The deputy looked unimpressed. That's called breaking and entering, Mr. Morrison. I don't care what papers you're holding. After Morrison left, the deputy took Sarah's statement, documented the attempted break-in, made it clear he knew the Morrison family's reputation even if he couldn't do much about their tactics. They'll be back, he said. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe they'll wait a week, but people like Morrison don't stop when it is close to something they want. You need better security than sleeping in your car. But security cost money Sarah didn't have, and the Cannery was too remote for regular patrols. She was trapped in a situation where defending her property required resources she couldn't afford, where Morrison's wealth gave him advantages that made legal ownership feel meaningless. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Torres called 3 days after the attempted break-in, her voice urgent in ways that suggested she'd made a decision she'd been avoiding. I remembered something, Margaret said. James gave me an envelope in 1982, told me to keep it sealed until after he died and only give it to someone who bought the property legitimately, not to anyone who tried to force their way to ownership. I kept it all these years, waiting for the right person. I think that's you. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with 6 numbers written in James Henderson's handwriting, 18-47-33. Below the numbers, a note, whoever finds this earned it through honest purchase, not through Morrison theft and pressure. What's in the vault is 40 years of profit I chose to hide rather than see stolen by a family who believed they were entitled to wealth they'd never worked for. Use it better than I did, to build rather than hoard, to help rather than isolate. The Cannery served this community for 50 years. May what it protected serve longer and better. Sarah stood holding instructions to open a vault that might contain millions or might be empty, that represented either salvation or another cruel disappointment in a year full of them. But it also represented James Henderson's trust that someone would eventually buy his property honestly, that 40 years was enough time for Morrison obsession to fail, that legacy mattered more than immediate claim. She returned to the Cannery with Patricia as witness, both of them documenting everything with photographs and written observations. The metal door beneath the broken concrete waited in darkness, its combination lock showing numbers that hadn't been touched in 40 years. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the mechanism, 18 right, 47 left, 33 right. The lock clicked with the sound of tumblers falling into alignment, the door lifting on hinges that still functioned despite decades of disuse. Below the door, a ladder descended into darkness that a flashlight revealed as a concrete chamber maybe 15 feet on a side, its walls showing the careful construction of someone who'd built this space to last. And filling that chamber, stacked in organized rows, were metal cases marked with dates from the 1930s and 1940s, sealed containers that showed the careful preservation of someone who'd spent years accumulating something valuable enough to hide from government, family, and anyone who might claim it without earning the right. Patricia descended first, opened the nearest case with hands that showed the careful documentation of lawyer witnessing potential evidence. Inside, wrapped in oiled paper that had protected them for 8 decades, were bundles of currency, 20s and 100s and $500 bills from an era when such denominations were common. The case held easily $50,000 in Depression-era currency, probably worth triple that to collectors. And there were 40 more cases visible in the flashlight beam, plus what looked like safety deposit boxes and canvas bags and sealed containers that suggested James Henderson had spent decades converting Cannery profits to physical wealth that could be hidden and protected and left to whoever finally earned it. Sarah stood at the ladder's top looking down at treasure that would change everything, that would transform her desperate circumstances into security she'd never imagined, that came with complications about legal ownership and tax obligations and the certainty that Morrison would fight harder than ever to claim what he'd been pursuing for 40 years. Patricia emerged from the chamber looking stunned, her professional composure cracked by the scale of what they'd found. "I need to make calls. Tonight. We need tax attorneys and estate lawyers and criminal defense just in case. Because Sarah, what you just found is probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and defending your right to keep it is going to be the fight of your life." The authentication process took 6 weeks and cost $43,000 Sarah didn't have but that Patricia arranged through loans secured against the vault's presumed value. Experts from 3 different firms examined the currency, the bonds, the stock certificates, the gold coins that filled 20 of the sealed cases. Each examination confirmed what the first inspection had suggested: James Henderson had spent decades converting Cannery profits to assets that would hold value regardless of economic collapse, that could be hidden and protected until someone he trusted discovered them. The final accounting was staggering. $225 million in Depression-era currency, bonds, precious metals, and stocks that had appreciated over 80 years into values Henderson couldn't have anticipated. The $500 bills alone were worth 10 times their face value to collectors, and several of the bonds had matured multiple times, their compound interest creating wealth from wealth in ways that transformed the original amounts into something almost absurd. But the discovery triggered exactly what Patricia had warned about. The IRS immediately froze everything pending investigation into whether Henderson had paid taxes on the income he'd converted to hidden assets. The state claimed inheritance taxes on an estate that had never been properly settled. The Morrison family filed emergency injunctions claiming they had documentation proving partnership rights to Depression-era profits. Environmental regulators descended on the Cannery property demanding assessments of potential contamination from decades of food processing. Each claim required response, each investigation required cooperation and legal representation that consumed money Sarah had to borrow against assets she couldn't access. Within 2 months of opening the vault, she'd accumulated $90,000 in legal fees and expert costs, had spent countless hours in depositions and hearings, had watched her desperate gamble on a foreclosed cannery transform into a different kind of desperation where she technically owned hundreds of millions but couldn't pay for groceries. The Morrison family's escalation was immediate and vicious. Robert Morrison held a press conference claiming Sarah had discovered assets his grandfather had legally earned through partnership with James Henderson, that she was attempting to steal the Morrison family's rightful inheritance. He filed criminal complaints alleging Sarah had broken into sealed property and removed assets without proper authority. He pressured local banks to refuse her loans, contacted her potential employers with warnings about pending litigation that made her unemployable. The media attention was overwhelming. Local news portrayed it as a Cinderella story: single mother discovers treasure in abandoned cannery. National outlets focused on the legal battle: Morrison family fights for Depression-era fortune. True crime podcasts dissected James Henderson's motivations and the suspicious timing of his death. Sarah's life became public property, her circumstances examined and judged by strangers who had opinions about what she deserved and how she should handle wealth she'd stumbled into through desperation. Through it all, Lily watched her mother navigate pressures that would have broken most people, learned lessons about persistence that went beyond simple stubbornness into the realm of principle. They were still living in the car some nights, still scraping by on borrowed money, still one bad legal ruling away from losing everything. But Sarah refused to settle, refused to give the Morrisons even a portion of what they'd pursued through harassment rather than honest claim. The turning point came through Margaret Torres's testimony. At 86, she appeared in court to provide depositions about the cannery's Depression-era operations, about James Henderson's business practices, about the Morrison grandfather who'd been fired for theft in 1934 and whose family had been claiming victimhood ever since. James Henderson ran an honest operation, Margaret testified, her voice steady despite her age. He paid fair wages during the Depression, kept people employed when other businesses were failing, treated workers with dignity that was rare in those years. The Morrison grandfather stole from the cannery repeatedly, cash from the office, canned goods from inventory, equipment he sold for personal profit. James documented everything, gave him multiple chances to stop, finally had to fire him to protect the business. She produced records she'd kept for 60 years, payroll documents, theft reports, James Henderson's personal notes documenting the decision to terminate employment. The Morrison family's claims of partnership and shared ownership collapsed under documentation that showed their grandfather had been a thief fired for cause, not a wronged partner denied rightful profit. Robert Morrison's lawyers tried to discredit Margaret's testimony, claimed her memory was unreliable, suggested she'd fabricated documents to support Sarah's claim. But forensic analysis confirmed the paper's authenticity, and multiple witnesses from the cannery's final years corroborated Margaret's account. The Morrison family's legal position fell apart not through dramatic confrontation but through the patient accumulation of evidence that revealed truth they'd been denying for 3 generations. The IRS investigation took longer but reached similar conclusions. James Henderson had paid taxes on reported income, had been aggressive but legal in his deductions and accounting methods. The money he'd hidden represented profit after taxes, assets he'd chosen to accumulate in physical form rather than bank accounts. Because he'd paid taxes when the income was earned, the hidden wealth wasn't subject to additional taxation beyond standard estate settlement. The state's inheritance tax claim was more complicated. Henderson's estate had never been properly settled because the 40-year trust had frozen everything. But Patricia argued successfully that the trust itself constituted estate settlement, that the delay in accessing assets didn't create new tax obligations. The state accepted a settlement, 15% of the treasure's value, roughly $34 million, painful but manageable. After legal fees, expert costs, tax settlements, and environmental remediation of the cannery property, Sarah retained approximately $168 million. The number was meaningless in its scale, represented security so far beyond her previous circumstances that she had trouble processing what it actually meant for her and Lily's future. But she also understood James Henderson's warning about using wealth to build rather than hoard. The cannery property itself needed decisions, demolish the deteriorating buildings or restore them for some purpose, sell the land or develop it in ways that serve the community that had supported her through the legal battles. Sarah chose restoration. Using a portion of the treasure, she hired contractors to stabilize the main cannery building, to preserve its industrial character while making it safe and functional. The structure became a community food hub, commercial kitchen space for local producers, food processing facilities for small farms that couldn't afford their own equipment, storage and distribution for regional food systems that served rural communities. The transformation took 18 months and cost $12 million, money that could have been invested for better returns but that felt right in ways purely financial decisions didn't. The cannery had served the community for 50 years during its original operation. Its second life would honor that purpose while adapting to present needs. The foundation Sarah established operated on similar principles. Using substantial portions of the treasure's investment income, it funded scholarships for single parents pursuing education, provided emergency assistance to families facing eviction or homelessness, supported small businesses in rural communities struggling with economic transition. The foundation operated quietly, without publicity, helping people who needed the kind of chance Sarah had gotten through desperate gamble and James Henderson's trust. Margaret Torres became the foundation's first major recipient, receiving an endowment that ensured comfortable final years after a lifetime of work that had been honestly compensated but never generously rewarded. She cried when Sarah presented the gift, understanding it as recognition not just of her help but of a life spent in service to others. "James would be proud of what you're doing," Margaret said during one of their last conversations before her death at 88. He spent his final years regretting that he'd accumulated wealth but had failed at family, had protected assets but had died alone without heirs to pass them to. "You're correcting his mistakes, using what he preserved to build the connections he never managed." The Morrison family's response to their legal defeat was complicated. Robert Morrison initially filed appeals and continued fighting, but the strain showed in ways that suggested the 40-year pursuit had damaged him as much as it had obsessed him. His marriage fell apart under the pressure, his health deteriorated from stress, his business operations suffered as he devoted resources to battles he kept losing. His son Michael was the one who finally ended it, calling Sarah 18 months after the vault's discovery to request a meeting. They met at a coffee shop in town, Michael arriving alone and looking exhausted in ways that went beyond simple fatigue into the realm of moral weariness. "My father is 73 and dying," Michael said without preamble. Emphysema from 40 years of smoking, complicated by the stress of fighting for something that was never ours to claim. "His doctors say he has maybe 6 months, and he's spending them still convinced you stole our family's legacy. I'm sorry he's dying, but that doesn't change the facts. Your grandfather was fired for theft, not denied partnership. The treasure was James Henderson's, and he left it to whoever bought the property honestly. I know. I've read all the depositions, seen all the evidence. My grandfather lied about being a partner, my father believed the lie and built his life around reclaiming something we never had right to." Michael was quiet for a moment. "I'm not here to ask for money or to continue the fight. I'm here to apologize for what our family put you through and to ask if you'd be willing to meet my father before he dies so he can make his own apology." Sarah thought about this, about whether facing a dying man who'd harassed her would bring closure or just create new complications. But she also thought about Lily watching her handle this situation, about teaching lessons that went beyond simple victory into the realm of grace. Robert Morrison looked decades older than his 73 years, diminished by illness and defeat in ways that made Sarah's anger feel excessive. They met in his hospital room, Michael present as witness, both men carrying the weight of realizing too late that they'd wasted decades pursuing something that had poisoned 3 generations. "I'm sorry," Robert said, his voice weak but clear. "For the pressure, the harassment, the legal battles that were designed to break you rather than establish truth. My father raised me to believe the Hendersons had cheated us, that recovering what was rightfully ours was a moral imperative. I never questioned that belief until you forced me to buy standing ground I expected you to surrender. Why didn't you question it earlier? Before spending 40 years fighting? Pride. Sunk cost. The same reasons people persist in mistakes. Admitting I was wrong meant admitting I'd wasted my father's life and my own pursuing something based on lies he'd told himself about being a victim rather than someone fired for cause. Robert paused, struggling for breath. You used the treasure better than I would have. The community food hub, the foundation, the help you've given to people who needed it, that's legacy worth having. I spent my life accumulating property and money and left nothing but legal battles and family damage. After the visit, Sarah felt complicated emotions about a man who'd tried to destroy her through legal pressure but who'd at least achieved some recognition of his mistakes before dying. Forgiveness felt too simple for what he'd put her through, but understanding was possible, recognition that Morrison had been shaped by his own father's lies, that generational damage worked both ways, that breaking cycles required someone choosing to stop the patterns even when momentum made continuing easier. Robert Morrison died 6 weeks later. His obituary mentioned business successes and property developments but was notably silent about family or personal relationships, testament to a life that had prioritized acquisition over connection. Michael inherited the Morrison business operations and immediately began transforming them, shifting from aggressive acquisition tactics to legitimate development consulting, trying to build something that wasn't poisoned by his grandfather's theft and his father's obsession. For Sarah and Lily, the transformation of their circumstances happened gradually despite the sudden wealth. They bought a modest house near the Cannery, comfortable but not ostentatious, chosen because Lily loved the backyard and Sarah appreciated the reminder that security didn't require excess. Sarah returned to school, completing her business degree while learning how to manage foundations and investments that required expertise she'd never needed as a factory worker. Lily thrived in ways that went beyond simple material security into the realm of emotional stability. She had her own room, consistent schooling, activities and opportunities that had been impossible before. But more importantly, she'd watched her mother stand for principles when surrendering would have been easier, had learned that fighting for things cost something but that some costs were worth paying. The Cannery became a gathering place for the community, its restored building hosting events and providing services that honored James Henderson's original vision of supporting rural livelihoods. The vault itself was preserved as a historical exhibit, its entrance sealed behind glass that allowed visitors to see where Depression-era wealth had rested for 80 years, where Sarah had discovered treasure that changed everything but that mattered most through what she'd built with it. On quiet evenings, Sarah sometimes stood in the Cannery looking at spaces that had been decay and were now purpose, thinking about the journey from eviction notice to here. The treasure had been luck, but what she'd done with that luck was choice, standing against pressure when surrender looked reasonable, using wealth to help rather than hoard, teaching Lily that inheritance carried obligations extending beyond simple ownership into moral duty to serve purposes larger than personal security. James Henderson had died protecting his treasure, had spent his final weeks sealing it where the Morrisons couldn't find it, had trusted that 40 years would be enough time for someone honest to discover what he'd preserved. Sarah had been that someone, driven by desperation to a county auction where she'd bid $395 on property she'd never seen. The mathematics of it were absurd, $395 transformed into hundreds of millions through discovery and legal battles and stubborn refusal to surrender to people who'd expected poverty to make her weak. But the real transformation wasn't financial, it was understanding that sometimes desperate gambles led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try, that legacy was built through choices rather than simply received through luck, that wealth mattered most when it created opportunities for others rather than just security for yourself. Margaret Torres had been right, James Henderson would have been proud of what Sarah built from what he'd preserved. The Cannery served its community again, the treasure funded help for families that needed it, and Sarah had corrected Henderson's mistakes by building connections where he'd created isolation, by using wealth to help rather than accumulate. The land around the Cannery had seen nearly a century of history, boom years during the Depression when the Cannery provided jobs, decline when food processing moved elsewhere, abandonment when economics made small operations obsolete. Now it saw renewal, saw purpose reclaimed through someone who'd bought it desperate and had discovered both treasure and responsibility in equal measure. Lily asked occasionally about what would happen to the foundation and the Cannery after Sarah was gone, whether the work would continue beyond one generation. Sarah had thought about this, about inheritance and obligation, about passing forward not just wealth but the principles that made wealth meaningful. "You'll make your own choices," Sarah told her daughter. "But I hope I'm teaching you that having resources means having responsibility to use them well, that standing for things costs something but that some costs are worth paying, that the greatest legacy isn't what you own but what you build and who you help." The lessons were being learned through living rather than preaching, through Lily watching her mother navigate wealth with the same principles she'd shown during poverty. The Cannery stood as monument to those principles: restored buildings serving community needs, preserved vault teaching history, foundation helping families that needed the kind of chance Sarah had gotten through desperate gamble and James Henderson's trust. The journey from eviction to here had taken years, had required battles and persistence and luck that couldn't be predicted. But standing in the Cannery watching evening light paint the restored walls in amber and knowing that what had been decay was now purpose, that felt like completion, like honoring both the desperation that had brought her here and the courage it had taken to stand for what she'd found despite pressure to surrender. The land remembered everything: Henderson's decades of work, the Depression-era decisions to hide rather than trust, the Morrison family's 40-year pursuit, Sarah's desperate bid and the discovery that followed. It had given treasure that changed everything and demanded in return that the treasure be used to build rather than hoard, to help rather than isolate, to honor the trust Henderson had placed in whoever was desperate enough and stubborn enough and honest enough to find what he'd left protected. 15 years passed like the river that flowed beside the Cannery, each season leaving its mark on land that had transformed from industrial decay to living purpose. Sarah watched Lily grow from the 7-year-old girl who'd stood beside her at a county auction into a 22-year-old woman graduating with honors from business school, her thesis examining sustainable models for rural community development using the Cannery as her primary case study. The building itself had aged gracefully into its second life. The corrugated metal walls showed careful maintenance rather than rust, their industrial character preserved but their function transformed. The interior spaces that had once processed Depression-era fruit now hosted commercial kitchens where 32 small food businesses produced goods they couldn't afford to make elsewhere. The loading docks that had shipped canned produce across the country now distributed locally grown products to regional markets, connecting farmers with consumers in ways that honored tradition while adapting to present economics. The community food hub operated year-round, employing 47 people directly and supporting hundreds more through the businesses it enabled. Sarah had hired a professional manager 5 years ago, recognizing that the Cannery's success required expertise she couldn't provide while also managing the foundation and raising Lily. But she still visited weekly, still walked through spaces that had been her desperate gamble and had become proof that sometimes impossible luck led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. The foundation's impact had grown beyond what Sarah had initially envisioned. Over 15 years, it had provided scholarships to 214 children of single parents, had funded emergency assistance to 463 families facing eviction or homelessness, had supported 89 small businesses through transitions that would have destroyed them without help. The numbers represented lives changed, opportunities created, cycles broken for people who'd faced the same desperation Sarah had known before opening a vault that held Depression-era treasure. But more than the direct assistance, the foundation had influenced how the region thought about supporting families in crisis. Other organizations had adopted similar models, business leaders had committed resources to emergency assistance programs, policymakers had developed safety nets that recognized poverty wasn't a moral failing but a circumstance that could happen to anyone when jobs disappeared and circumstances accumulated. Margaret Torres had died 7 years earlier at 93, her final years spent helping Sarah understand the full scope of what James Henderson had created and protected. She'd left her own papers to the Cannery's historical collection, 60 years of correspondence and photographs and documents that revealed the complicated man who'd saved profits in sealed vaults and had died alone protecting wealth he'd never enjoyed. James made choices based on Depression-era trauma, Margaret had explained during one of their last conversations. He'd watched banks fail and savings disappear, had seen people lose everything through trusting institutions that collapsed. So he protected wealth in ways that made sense to someone who'd survived economic catastrophe but that isolated him from everyone he might have shared his life with. The vault itself had become a museum exhibit, its metal door preserved behind glass in the Cannery's historical display. Visitors could see where treasure had rested for 80 years, could read James Henderson's final note about hoping someone would use his wealth better than he had. School groups toured regularly, learning about Depression economics and rural industries and the complicated mathematics of inheritance that wasn't just about receiving but about choosing what to build from what you'd been given. Michael Morrison had become an unexpected ally over the years. After his father's death, he'd transformed the Morrison business from aggressive acquisition tactics to legitimate community development, had partnered with Sarah's foundation on affordable housing projects and small business support programs. The collaboration had been awkward at first, both of them navigating the weight of their family's conflict, but it had evolved into genuine respect founded on shared understanding that generational damage had to be broken through someone choosing different patterns. My grandfather's theft and my father's obsession cost our family 3 generations of relationships, Michael had told Sarah during a partnership meeting 3 years ago. I spent my childhood watching my father destroy himself pursuing something that was never ours. I won't do that to my own kids. I'd rather build something legitimate that they can be proud of than pass forward the kind of toxic inheritance I received. On a warm evening in late September, 15 years after Sarah had bought the Cannery at auction, she stood at the property's edge watching sunset paint the river in shades of amber and rose. Lily found her there, both of them comfortable in the silence that had developed through years of shared experience navigating wealth and responsibility and the weight of choices that shaped what came next. I've been accepted to the graduate program, Lily said, referring to her application to study nonprofit management and sustainable development. Full scholarship plus stipend. I start in January. Sarah felt pride mixed with the bittersweet recognition that Lily was stepping fully into adult life, was choosing her own path that honored what she'd learned but wasn't bound by it. That's wonderful, sweetheart. The program is perfect for what you want to do. I want to expand the foundation's model, Lily continued. Show other communities how to build similar support systems, how to use local resources and wealthy benefactors to create safety nets that actually help people facing crisis. The Cannery proves it works, that you can operate sustainably while serving people who need serving. Her passion reminded Sarah of her own desperate determination 15 years ago, the stubborn refusal to accept that circumstances defined limits you couldn't exceed through trying. But where Sarah's fight had been born from survival necessity, Lily's commitment came from having watched her mother transform desperation into purpose, from understanding that wealth created obligations to help others facing similar struggles. The Henderson Legacy Foundation, named to honor the man whose treasure had funded it, had become one of the region's most respected nonprofits, known for practical help delivered with dignity rather than judgment. Sarah had served as its executive director for 12 years before transitioning to board chair, recognizing that the foundation's future required professional leadership that could scale its impact beyond what she could manage while also being present for Lily's childhood. But the work had shaped her in ways that went beyond professional accomplishment into the realm of identity transformation. She was no longer the desperate single mother who'd bought a foreclosed cannery because she'd run out of reasonable options. She was someone who'd stood against pressure from people with more resources, who'd used impossible luck to build something that served purposes beyond personal security, who'd taught her daughter that inheritance carried obligations extending far into moral duty to use well what you'd been given. The journey had left scars alongside growth. Years of legal battles and media scrutiny and constant pressure from Morrison harassment had taken their toll. Sarah's health had suffered from stress, her relationships had been complicated by wealth that made people see her differently, her sense of privacy had been permanently compromised by becoming a public figure whether she wanted that role or not. The treasure had solved financial desperation but had created new complications that money couldn't fix. But she'd also gained more than she'd lost. Lily had grown up secure and stable, had absorbed lessons about standing for principles and using resources to help rather than hoard. The Cannery served its community in ways that honored James Henderson's original vision while adapting to present needs. The foundation had helped hundreds of families avoid the kind of crisis Sarah had faced. Those gains outweighed the costs, made the battles worth fighting even when victory had sometimes felt more like survival than triumph. On a cool morning in early October, the Cannery hosted what had become an annual tradition, the Henderson Heritage Celebration, a day when the building opened to the community, when families who'd been helped by the foundation shared their stories, when local producers who used the food hub sold their goods and connected with customers who valued the work. Patricia Walsh attended, now fully retired but still sharp and engaged. She'd guided Sarah through legal battles that had tested everything Sarah had seen the fight through to completion without asking for more than contingency fees that honored both their contributions to victory. "James Henderson would be astounded by what you've built," Patricia said, watching Lily give tours of the cannery to families with children. "He protected wealth but failed at family, accumulated assets but died alone. You corrected his mistakes, used what he preserved to build community connections he never managed, taught Lily what he never learned about wealth mattering most through what you build with it rather than what you simply own." The celebration drew 500 people, the cannery's parking area overflowing with vehicles, the building itself alive with conversation and laughter and the energy of community gathered for shared purpose. Sarah moved through crowds greeting people she'd known for years and strangers who'd come because the cannery's reputation had spread beyond the immediate region. A woman approached her near the vault exhibit, maybe 35, carrying a toddler and looking nervous in ways Sarah recognized from her own years of poverty. "I wanted to thank you," the woman said quietly. "Your foundation helped us last year when my husband died and I was 3 weeks from eviction with 2 kids. The emergency assistance bought me time to find work, to get stable. I don't know what would have happened without that help." Sarah heard in the woman's story her own desperation 15 years ago, understood that the foundation's most important work happened in these moments of preventing crisis rather than in the larger-scale achievements that earned publicity. "I'm glad we could help. And I hope you'll remember it when you're stable and can help someone else facing similar circumstances. That's how this works, we lift each other." As evening settled over the cannery, Sarah stood alone in the main building after crowds had departed, looking at spaces that had been transformed from decay to purpose through choosing to build rather than simply claim wealth. The industrial character remained, high ceilings and exposed trusses, concrete floors and metal walls, but it had been reclaimed and made functional, turned from monument to abandonment into living workspace that served present needs. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the eviction notice that had started everything, about the desperate bid at a county auction that should have been another mistake but had somehow led to treasure and responsibility in equal measure. The $395 she'd scraped together had transformed into hundreds of millions through discovery and legal battles and stubborn refusal to surrender to people who'd expected poverty to make her weak. But the real transformation hadn't been financial, it had been learning that legacy was built through choices rather than simply received through luck, that standing for principles cost something but that some costs were worth paying, that wealth mattered most when it created opportunities for others rather than just security for yourself. Lily joined her as darkness completed its claim on the day, both of them walking through the building that had shaped their lives, past the vault exhibit that held James Henderson's note about using his treasure better than he had, through commercial kitchens where tomorrow people would arrive to continue work that sustained their families and served their communities. "Do you ever regret it?" Lily asked. "Fighting the Morrisons instead of taking their money and walking away?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the years of legal battles and stress and public scrutiny that accepting Morrison's offer would have avoided. "Sometimes I wonder what a different path would have looked like. But then I remember what fighting taught you, that standing for things has meaning, that powerful people don't win just because they apply pressure, that desperate people who try impossible things sometimes get rewarded with chances to become who they're meant to be." They locked the cannery and walked to Sarah's car, both of them heading home through darkness that felt comfortable now, familiar roads leading to lives they'd built from desperation and discovery and the stubborn belief that inheritance carried obligations beyond simple ownership. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs, witnessing the slow work of properties being reclaimed and wealth being used wisely in families choosing to build rather than simply inherit. James Henderson had spent decades converting cannery profits to physical wealth, had sealed it where the Morrisons couldn't find it, had died trusting that 40 years would be enough time for someone honest to discover what he'd preserved. Sarah had been that someone, driven by desperation to purchase property she'd never seen, discovering treasure that changed everything but that mattered most through what she'd built with it. The mathematics of it remained absurd. $395 transformed into generational wealth through luck and persistence in battles that tested everything she had. But the real mathematics was simpler and more profound. One desperate woman plus one sealed vault plus 15 years of choosing to help rather than hoard equaled community transformation that extended far beyond simple financial assistance into the realm of proving that desperate people deserve chances, that wealth created obligations to serve purposes beyond personal security, that legacy was measured through what you built and who you helped rather than what you simply owned. The cannery sat in darkness now, its restored building waiting for tomorrow's work, its vault preserved as testament to what had been hidden and discovered, its future secured through Sarah's choices about using treasure to build rather than accumulate. The land around it had seen a century of change, boom years when the cannery employed hundreds, decline when economics moved elsewhere, abandonment when maintaining deteriorating buildings made no sense, and now renewal as the property served its community again through different purpose but similar commitment to supporting rural livelihoods. James Henderson had failed at family but had succeeded at protecting wealth, had died alone but had left treasure for whoever was desperate enough and stubborn enough and honest enough to find it. Sarah had corrected his mistakes, built family and community where he'd created isolation, used wealth to connect rather than protect, taught Lily that the greatest inheritance wasn't what you owned but what you chose to build from what you'd been given. The river flowed past the cannery as it had for millennia, patient and persistent, carving stone and carrying silt and bearing witness to everything that had happened here. It had seen the cannery's construction in 1928, its profitable Depression years, its decline and closure, its abandonment and James Henderson's final weeks sealing treasure beneath its floor. Now it saw renewal, saw purpose reclaimed, saw proof that sometimes impossible luck led to places that honored both desperation and courage. 15 years had transformed a foreclosed industrial property into living legacy, had changed a desperate single mother into someone who'd stood for principles when surrendering looked reasonable, had shaped a frightened 7-year-old into a woman who understood that wealth carried obligations to help others facing struggles you'd survived. The cannery would stand long after Sarah was gone, would continue serving and teaching and preserving, would remain proof that what was worth defending could be defended when people were stubborn enough and lucky enough and principled enough to stand against forces that measured success through acquisition rather than creation. The land remembered everything, Henderson's decades protecting his cannery, the Depression-era decisions to hide rather than trust, the Morrison family's 40-year pursuit, Sarah's desperate bid and the discovery that followed. It had given treasure that changed everything and had demanded in return that the treasure be used to build rather than hoard, to help rather than isolate, to honor the trust Henderson had placed in whoever was desperate enough to find what he'd left protected. That trust had been earned through standing ground, through refusing to surrender to pressure, through choosing to build something that mattered more than personal security. Sarah had proven worthy of it not through finding the vault but through what she'd done after finding it, the battles fought, the community built, the lessons taught to Lily about courage and integrity and the cost of standing for things when standing would have been easier to avoid. The story would be told for generations, the single mother who bought a foreclosed cannery for $395 and discovered treasure worth hundreds of millions, who fought off wealthy families and built community resources and showed that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. It would become legend, would be simplified and dramatized and probably distorted in the retelling. But those who knew the truth would remember what mattered most, not the treasure itself but what Sarah built with it, not the battles won but the principles defended, not the wealth accumulated but the community served and the legacy created through choosing to help rather than hoard, to build rather than protect, to honor inheritance through using it well rather than simply claiming it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.